Ruth Calloway noticed the ants first. It was the middle of a dry June, and the black ants that always kept their hill beside the fence post had moved it 40 feet uphill toward the ridge, without any rain to explain the change. She stood at the fence with a bucket of wash water going warm in her hand and watched them for longer than the task deserved. Ants did not move a hill for nothing. Her grandmother had told her that once, years back, in the flat, unhurried voice she used for things she expected to be remembered rather than admired. Ruth did not know yet what the ants knew. She only knew that she trusted them more than she trusted the sky, which had shown nothing but a hard blue for 11 days running. She said nothing about it to her Uncle Weller, who was mending harness on the porch and did not care for omens before breakfast. She only marked the date on the inside of the barn door in chalk, the way she marked most things worth remembering, and went on with the wash water. That was the whole of it, that first morning. No storm, no fire, no crisis. Only a woman noticing that the world had shifted its weight, quietly, the way a floorboard does before it finally gives. The land Ruth worked was the poorest quarter of what had once been her grandmother's homestead, split 3 ways after the old woman's death the autumn before. Her older brother had taken the bottom land along the creek, black soil that turned easy and drank rain like a sponge. Her cousin Emmett had taken the timber stand, tall pine that would fetch good money at the mill in Callister. Ruth had taken the ridge, thin red clay over limestone, dry as a Sunday sermon, with a house so old the chinking had gone to powder in the corners. Nobody had argued with her for it. Nobody had thought there was anything worth arguing over. You got the bones of the place, Uncle Weller told her, not unkindly, the day the deed was settled. Rest of us got the meat. Ruth had only nodded. She had learned, growing up under her grandmother's roof, that a thing said kindly could still be wrong, and a thing that sounded like a consolation could still be a door. Her grandmother, Ada Calloway, had come out from Kentucky as a girl of 19 with a Bible, a cast-iron pot, and, folded inside the pot, wrapped in oilcloth so old it had gone the color of tea, a notebook bound in board covers with a leather thong. Ruth had grown up watching her grandmother write in it by lamplight, small tight letters that filled every margin, and had never once been allowed to read it. When you need it, the old woman said, it'll be yours. Not before. She had died in her sleep in February, and the notebook had turned up in April, inside the pot, exactly where she'd always kept it, as if she had known precisely when Ruth would come looking. Ruth had read it twice through by then. She was reading it a third time now, on the evening of the day the ants moved their hill, by the light of a single tallow candle, at the kitchen table with the dog Sable lying against her feet. Most of it was ordinary. Recipes for salve, a cure for scours and calves, diagrams of a quilt pattern half worked out and then abandoned. But threaded through the ordinary pages, in ink gone the color of rust, were 3 entries that Ruth had read so many times she no longer needed the candle to see them. Dug the cellar to 9 foot this year, past what Samuel wanted, and he says I have gone foolish with a spade. 9 foot puts you below the frost and below the heat both, and the clay at that depth holds its own coolness like a held breath. A cellar dug shallow is a cellar dug for one season. A cellar dug deep is dug for whatever comes. Line the walls with the blue clay from the spring bank, packed thin, no thicker than 2 fingers, and let it cure a full month before setting anything against it. The blue clay does not crack the way the red does. It breathes just enough and no more. Bank the roof with ash and sand mixed even, a foot deep over the timbers, then sod over that. Ash will not burn what is already burned. Remember this if the year turns dry. A fire wants fuel, not ash, and it will pass over ground that has none to give it. Ruth read that last line 3 times before she closed the notebook. Outside, the wind had come up from the south, dry as a stove lid, and it did not smell like rain. She began digging the new cellar the following week. There was already a root cellar on the ridge property, a shallow pit her grandfather had dug 40 years back, 4 feet down and lined with unmortared stone, good enough for potatoes and not much else. Ruth did not tear it out. She dug beside it instead, in the hard red clay behind the spring house, starting with a spade and then, when the spade would not go deeper without help, with a mattock and a pick that had belonged to her grandmother's husband and had not been swung in a decade. She dug alone for the first 4 days. On the 5th, Pike came. Pike Ostner was 17 and hired himself out around the county for whatever wages a boy that age could get, which was not much, and he had worked 2 summers for old Ada Calloway before she died, mucking stalls and mending fence, saying almost nothing the whole while. He turned up at Ruth's gate on the 5th morning with his own shovel over his shoulder and did not ask permission. He only asked where she wanted the spoil piled, and then he started digging. "Your uncle says you've gone and dug a grave for the house instead of a cellar," Pike said, some hours in, not looking up from the clay. "Uncle Weller talks the way creeks run," Ruth said. "Downhill, and not always toward anything." Pike almost smiled at that. He did not stop digging. By the 2nd week, the pit was 8 feet down, and Ruth's palms had split and healed and split again. And Uncle Weller had stopped mending harness on his own porch long enough to come stand at the lip of the hole and look down into it with an expression that was not quite disapproval and not quite anything else. "You'll hit water," he said. "Grandmother's cellar never hit water. Not the year of the flood, not any year. Your grandmother's cellar was 9 foot in bottomland with a rock shelf under it. This is ridge clay. It don't behave the same." Ruth did not answer that directly, because she did not yet know if he was wrong. She only kept digging, and Weller stood a while longer, working his jaw the way he did when he was worried rather than angry, and then he went back to his harness. He was not a man who mocked her. That distinction mattered, though Ruth could not have said exactly why it mattered until later, when the summer had worn on and worn her down with it. Weller's doubt did not come from scorn. It came from the plain arithmetic of a man who had buried 2 children to fever and 1 wife to childbed, and had learned, hard, that the ground did not owe anyone an easy answer just because they had worked hard enough to deserve one. He was afraid for her. He said so, eventually, in his own roundabout way, and that fear sat differently in Ruth's chest than laughter would have. Laughter she could have ignored. Fear from a man who loved her, however sideways, she had to carry. At 9 feet, the pit struck the blue clay her grandmother's notebook had described, a seam of it running through the red like a vein of cooler stone, and Ruth stood at the bottom of her own hole in the fading light of a July evening and pressed her palm flat against it and felt, for the first time in weeks, something that was not quite hope, but stood near enough to it to be mistaken for kin. She lined the walls the way the notebook said, 2 fingers thick, no more. She and Pike hauled the blue clay up from the spring bank in a stone boat behind Ruth's horse, Briar, a big raw-boned gelding who had never much cared for the stone boat's noise and made his opinion known every trip by laying his ears flat and blowing hard through his nose, though he pulled all the same, because he was, underneath his complaining, a willing animal. They packed the clay against the red walls of the pit in thin courses, tamping each one with the flat of a shovel, and left it to cure. The notebook said a month. Ruth gave it 3 weeks, because by then the sky had gone the color of old pewter with smoke that was not yet close enough to smell, but was close enough to see. A haze sitting low over the western ridges that had not lifted in 4 days, and she did not think they had a month left to spare. The roof went on in early August. Timbers first, oak from Emmett's stand, traded for 2 days of Ruth's labor mending his fence line. A trade Emmett made without much thinking about it, since he did not yet believe the cellar was worth more than the labor. Over the timbers, ash and sand mixed even, a foot deep, exactly as the notebook instructed, and Ruth stood over the ash pile with an old milk pail and counted the pails aloud as she poured, the way her grandmother must have counted, because a foot of ash over a roof that size did not happen by guessing. 41 pails, she chalked on the spring house door that night, under the date. Foot deep, near enough. The chalkboard on the spring house door became, without her quite deciding it should, a ledger of the whole summer. She had started it out of habit, the habit her grandmother had given her, of writing down what could not yet be proven so that later it could be checked. But as June wore into July and July began to curdle into August, the chalk marks stopped being about the cellar alone and became something closer to a countdown. Flour, 19 days at present use. Water in the spring house barrel, down 2 inches since Tuesday. Corn in the crib, enough for the stock through September if nothing else fails. She rubbed out each figure and wrote the new one beside it rather than over it, so that anyone standing at the door could read the summer's decline in a column of numbers, each one a little worse than the one above it, like rungs on a ladder going down into a well. The first attempt at storing the harvest in the new cellar failed within 9 days, and it failed quietly, the way most true failures do, not with a crash, but with a smell. Ruth had put up the season's first potatoes, a good early crop pulled ahead of the dry weather's worst, along with 3 crocks of pickled beans and a wheel of cheese traded from a neighbor woman 2 farms over. On the 9th day, she went down the new ladder into the cellar and found the air close and wrong, thick with a smell like a wet coat left too long in a trunk, and 2 of the crocks had gone soft with mold at the rims, and the cheese had sweated a slick film that had no business forming in a cellar meant to hold cool, dry air. She sat on the bottom rung of the ladder a long while, in the dark, with the lamp guttering, and did not cry, because crying was not a thing Ruth Calloway did easily, but she came close enough to know the shape of it. Pike found her there an hour later, having come by to return a borrowed hay hook, and did not say anything comforting, because Pike did not deal in comfort any more than he dealt in mockery. He only climbed down, took the lamp from her hand, and held it up to the ceiling. "No vent," he said. Ruth looked up. He was right. She had built the cellar for depth and coolness and had never once, in all the careful counting of ash pails and clay courses, thought to give the air anywhere to go. She climbed back up to the kitchen table that night and read the notebook a 4th time, slower than before, hunting not for the passages she already knew by heart, but for anything she might have skimmed past believing it beside the point. She found it on the second-to-last page, in a hand shakier than the rest, written closer to the end of her grandmother's life than most of what came before. "A cellar that does not breathe will sour its own keep. Run a clay pipe from the northeast corner up through the roof bank, no wider than a man's wrist, and stop it with a wood plug you can pull by a string. Open it of a cool morning, close it by noon. The air must turn over or the cold will spoil as sure as the heat." Ruth read the line twice, and then a 3rd time, and something in her chest loosened that had been pulled tight for 9 days without her fully knowing it. Pike helped her set the vent pipe the next morning, a length of hollowed cedar packed with clay at the joints, running up through the ash bank at an angle so rain would not run straight down it, stopped at the top with a wood plug on a rawhide string that Ruth could reach by standing on the 3rd rung of the ladder. They aired the cellar for 2 full days before restocking it, morning and evening both, and on the 3rd day Ruth went down with the lamp and breathed air that was cool and clean and faintly sweet with the smell of the blue clay, and nothing more. Vent set. Air turned twice a day. She chalked it on the spring house door, and under it, smaller, cheese saved. Beans not. A ledger did not lie to spare anyone's feelings, and Ruth had come to prefer it that way. The smoke thickened through the last weeks of August, though the fire itself stayed far enough off that most of the county went about its business as if the haze were only weather, only a long dry spell that would break eventually the way every dry spell had before. Ruth did not entirely believe that, and neither, she suspected, did the ants, who had not moved their hill back down. She kept digging shelf space into the cellar walls in the evenings after her regular chores were done, cutting niches into the cured blue clay for jars and crocks, packing the cold floor with sand a full hand deep to draw moisture away from anything set on it. She dried what she could not can, apples sliced thin and strung on twine, beans left to rattle hard in their pods, a portion of the corn parched in a skillet and sealed in stoneware. Everything that went below ground went with a number chalked beside it on a slate she kept just inside the cellar door, a running tally that she updated by lamplight the way her grandmother had updated the notebook, because a full cellar unrecorded was, in a dry year, no better than an empty one. A man could starve 2 feet from plenty if he did not know precisely how much plenty he had. Potatoes, 6 bushel. Corn, dried, for sacks. Apples, 11 strings. Flour, 2 barrels, 1 broached. By the 2nd week of September, the number of days the family could feed itself without fresh supply had climbed past 90, a figure that would have seemed impossible in July, and Ruth found she took a grim, quiet satisfaction in watching that number grow even as the number of days without rain grew alongside it, the 2 columns racing each other up the slate like a contest whose outcome she could not yet call. The dog began acting strangely in the 3rd week of September. Sable was an old dog by then, a black and tan bitch with gray coming in heavy at the muzzle, and she had never in Ruth's memory refused to come into the house of an evening. But 3 nights running, she would not come past the cellar door. She stood at the top of the new ladder and whined, low in her throat, and would not be coaxed down into the cool dark even with a piece of fatback held out as bait. And on the 4th night, She took to pacing the yard fence at all hours instead of sleeping on the porch, nose up, working the air. Briar was worse. He would not settle in the stable of an evening, kicking at his stall boards until Pike, sleeping in the loft above, came down twice in one night to quiet him. And on the morning of the 22nd of September, he refused his grain entirely, standing at the far corner of the paddock with his head up and his nostrils working, facing west. Ruth stood beside him along while that morning with her hand flat on his neck, feeling the fine tremor running under his hide, and looked west herself, at the haze that had gone from gray to the color of a bruise healing badly, yellow-brown low on the horizon where the sun ought to have been clean. She did not need the dog or the horse to tell her the fire had turned toward the ridge. She had already begun to smell it herself, 2 mornings running, a green resinous burn under the dust, the smell of standing timber going up rather than brush. That was the week the first of them came to her door. Ansel Cray arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, walking rather than riding because his horse had gone lame in the dry, hard-packed roads 2 farms south. He was a seed man, one of the few in the county who kept back proper stock rather than buying fresh each spring, and he stood at Ruth's gate turning his hat in his hands in a way that told her, before he said a word, that he had swallowed some pride to come. "My seed corn's gone," he said. "Rats got into the crib, and what they didn't get, the dry rot took. I've nothing for spring planting, Ruth, not an ear of it, and I don't know another soul who'd have kept enough back to spare." Ruth took him down into the cellar herself, past the vent pipe she opened for him to see, past the shelves cut into the cured clay, to the corner where she had stored 4 sacks of seed corn apart from the eating corn, sealed in stoneware crocks with the lids waxed shut, sitting on a shelf raised 8 inches off the sand floor. "Grandmother's notebook says seed keeps different from eating corn," Ruth told him, lifting one crock down. "Drier, and off the ground, and dark the whole while. I set some back separate in July, before I knew what for." She gave him 2 sacks, and would not take payment for it beyond his word that he'd return the same measure from his next good crop, and Ansel Cray walked back down her lane with his hat back on his head properly for the first time since he'd arrived, and did not turn to look back, because a man does not often let another see his face when it has just been handed something he no longer expected to get. Seed corn out, 2 sacks. Ansel Cray, to be repaid in kind. Ruth chalked it beside the older figures, and the slate inside the cellar door was beginning to read less like a countdown and more like a record of a debt the ridge was owed and had begun, at last, to collect. The second came 9 days later. Marta Foss came with her 2 youngest children, a boy and a girl neither past 7 years old, and she came at dusk, which told Ruth something about the state of things before Marta said a word, because Marta Foss was not a woman who traveled after dark if she could help it. "The well's gone bitter," Marta said, standing in Ruth's kitchen with a child on each hip near enough that she could not properly hold either. "Tastes of ash even boiled. Hollis says it'll clear once the fire's past, but the children can't wait on that, and I've nowhere else to carry water from, not with the creek run down to a trickle same as everybody's." Ruth filled 2 of Marta's jugs from the springhouse barrel, and then, because 2 jugs would not carry a family of 6 more than 3 days, she took Marta down into the cellar and showed her the sand floor trench Ruth had dug along the north wall in August, half by instinct and half by a line in the notebook about drawing seep water through packed sand to clean it of taint, a trench that had, over the dry weeks, gathered a slow trickle of groundwater filtered clean and sweet through 9 feet of clay and stone. "It's not much," Ruth said, dipping a gourd full for the boy to drink first, watching his face for any grimace at the taste, and finding none. "A gourd or 2 a day, but it'll hold, long as the trench keeps seeping and it tastes clean." Marta Foss did not have much to say to that. She only pressed her forehead briefly against Ruth's shoulder, the way women did who had run past the point of proper words, and took her children and 2 jugs and the promise of a standing gourd or 2 a day, home through the dusk. The third came in the first week of October, and he came not for food or water but for shelter, and his arrival was the one that told Ruth, more than the smoke or the dog or the horse, that the summer's long slow squeeze had at last become something with an edge to it. Old Dietrich Rule lived alone on the far side of the ridge, a widower near 70 who kept to himself and had never once, in Ruth's memory, asked a soul for anything. He arrived on foot, out of breath, his beard singed at one side, and behind him, low along the western tree line, the sky had gone the deep, unnatural orange of a sun that was not setting so much as being blotted out. "It's crowned the ridge past Emmett's stand," he said. "Jump the fire road. I couldn't get my wagon hitched in time. Ruth, I've nowhere to go that's low enough and far enough, and my legs won't carry me clear of it before it's here." There was no argument to be had, and no time for one. Ruth took him down the ladder into the cellar herself, and Weller came at a run not 5 minutes behind him, having seen the same sky from his own porch and ridden hard to reach her. And Pike came from the stable with Briar and Sable both, the horse wild-eyed and hard to lead. The dog pressed so close against Pike's leg, she nearly tripped him twice. They went down into the cellar together, Ruth, Weller, Pike, old Dietrich Rule, the dog, and, after considerable coaxing and one badly bruised shin, the horse as well, led down a ramp of packed earth Ruth had built into the pit's south slope back in August for exactly this unadmitted possibility, though she had not let herself call it that at the time. Ruth pulled the vent plug free before she pulled the ladder down after them, so the pipe stood open to whatever air the fire left above, and then she pulled the trapdoor shut over their heads and set the bar across it, and the 6 of them, 5 living souls and 1 badly frightened gelding, sat in the dark cured clay beneath 9 feet of earth and a foot of ash and sod, and listened. There was no single moment of terror to it, no great roar or crack that split the world in two. That was not how it came. What came instead was a long, low sound like a wind that never stopped rising, hours of it, muffled through the earth into something closer to a held breath than a scream, and under it, once, twice, a distant collapsing crash that might have been the house, or might have been the barn, or might have been nothing but a burning tree giving way somewhere off in the timber, and no way from below to know which. Weller sat with his hand on Ruth's shoulder the whole while, and did not speak. Old Dietrich Rule prayed, quietly, in German, the words worn smooth from long use. Pike kept one hand on Briar's halter and one on Sable's neck, and the dog, who had refused the cellar every night for 3 weeks, lay pressed against his leg now, without a single sound of protest, as if she had only ever been afraid of what was coming and not of the ground itself. They stayed below for 11 hours. When Ruth finally lifted the plug from the vent pipe near dawn and drew a breath through it, the air that came down was hot and stank of char, but it was air, and it did not choke them, and that alone told her something of what waited above before she ever climbed the ladder to see it. The house was gone. So was the barn and the spring house roof, and every fence post on the ridge burned down to a blackened stub, and the timber stand that had been Emmett's pride stood as a field of standing char, smoke still rising off it in thin gray threads in the early light. The ground itself, where it had been bare dirt or dry grass, was scorched black and still warm underfoot through the soles of Ruth's boots. But the ash bank over the cellar roof had not burned, because there was nothing in ash for a fire to take. The sod atop it had gone brown and crisped but held, and the cellar beneath it. The walls of cured blue clay, the shelves cut deep into cool earth, the sandfloor trench still seeping its slow clean trickle, the crocks of dried corn and strung apples, and the 2 remaining sacks of seed grain, stood exactly as it had stood the evening before, cool and dark and whole, while everything built above the ground had burned to nothing in a single night. Ruth stood in the black ruin of her grandmother's homestead a long while, with Weller beside her, and Pike holding both animals' leads, and old Dietrich Rule sitting on an overturned washtub that had somehow survived, and none of them said very much, because there was not very much, in that first hour, that could be said. House gone. Barn gone. Cellar whole. Ruth chalked it that evening on a scrap of board propped against the cellar door, because the spring house door itself had burned along with everything else, and the chalk was one of the few things she had thought to carry down with her the night before, kept in her apron pocket out of habit rather than foresight. What came after was not swift, and it was not dramatic, and it did not resolve itself in a single morning the way a storm's aftermath might have. It came instead the way the whole summer had come, in weeks, counted and chalked and endured one figure at a time. Ansel Cray returned in the spring with not the 2 sacks he owed but 3, having had, he said, a better yield than he'd hoped from seed that had wintered dry and dark exactly as the notebook promised. And Ruth planted the ridge again that April with corn drawn from her own cellar's seed stock. the only unburned ground for 2 miles that had anything at all left to plant with. Marta Foss sent her boy over 3 mornings a week through that first winter to help Ruth clear char from what had been the dooryard, unasked, because a debt of water was, in Marta's accounting, not the kind that could be repaid in coin. Old Dietrich Rule rebuilt nothing of his own place that winter, being too old and too alone for it, and instead took up residence in a lean-to pike and Weller framed against the cellar's south slope, close by the ramp that had carried the horse down, and told anyone who'd listen that he intended to die under that particular hill of ash and no other, since it had already proven it would hold. Weller helped Ruth frame a new house that spring, smaller than the last one, set 30 yards further from the timber line on Ruth's own quiet insistence, and he did not once, in all the months of framing and raising, say another word about graves or bones or the meat of the land, though he did, on the day the roof went up, stand a long while at the cellar's trapdoor with his hat in his hand, looking down into the cool dark the way a man looks at something he has finally been made to believe in. Ruth dug the new house's ordinary cellar shallow, for feet, good enough for the daily traffic of potatoes and milk crocks. But she left the deep one exactly as it stood, and added to it that second spring, and the spring after, until the shelving ran the whole of the north wall, and the vent pipe wanted rebuilding twice over from where. She kept the notebook in the deep cellar after that, wrapped again in oilcloth, set on its own shelf cut into the cured blue clay, not because the house was any less safe to keep it in, but because it seemed to Ruth, turning the thing over in her mind on quiet evenings, that the notebook belonged in the one place on the whole ridge that had already proven it could survive whatever came, and that a lesson learned in the ground ought, by rights, to be kept there. She added her own pages to it that winter, in a hand not yet as steady as her grandmother's, but getting there, and among them, near the end of what she wrote, was a single line that she did not copy from anywhere, because it had come to her honestly, over one long dry summer of digging and doubting and digging again. A cellar dug deep enough does not save you the night the fire comes. It saves you every ordinary morning after, for as long as it takes the ground to remember how to grow something again, and the ground remembers slower than any man wants it to, but it always, in its own time, remembers. The chalk slate by the cellar door still hung there years later, the old figures long since rubbed away and replaced a dozen times over with the ordinary business of harvests and hard winters. But Ruth never did erase that first line, the one from the worst of it, the one that read simply, cellar, hole. She left it in the corner of the slate, small and a little crooked, where anyone climbing down for milk or potatoes might see it without being told what it meant, and where she herself could look at it, of an evening, and remember that some things a person builds are not built to be finished quickly and are not the worse for that. They are only, in the end, built to last exactly as long as they are needed, which is very often longer than anyone standing at the edge of the hole, watching a woman dig, believes.